I invite your attention to Matthew chapter 13. We're dealing with verse 34 and 35. We came back at this last week on Saturday night. We only got about halfway through what we wanted to say, and want to try to capture that again in Matthew chapter 13, verse 34 through verse 35. It's probably been more of a significant passage than you may recognize. It would be a passage maybe that you would skip over. But again, Jesus in Matthew chapter 12 has had a tough day with the Pharisees. They've been after the disciples. They've been after Jesus. It's criticism. He's done everything from give them theology to give them Old Testament Bible stories. He's told them, he's tried to show them logic, and they just keep coming at him. And there's such overwhelming conflict, and he realizes he's not getting through to them. He's not communicating. They've even come to the point they've criticized him for being full of the devil, saying, oh, your miracles are good, but you're full of the devil, and that's how you're doing it. And Jesus tries to show them all of that. And it's the end of that day, after a whole day of that, where Jesus is realizing he's not communicating well. That is, the truth is not getting through to his disciples. And he then begins to, in chapter 13, to talk to them in parables. And just from that time on, he speaks to them, it says, always in parables. Never preaches that he doesn't do it in parables. And as that develops, of course, the disciples are deeply aware of this, saying, hey, why have you changed on us? What's going on? And Jesus begins to explain to them in chapter 13, verse 11, exactly why he's doing that. And he says that the answer is found in the fact that they have turned off their hearing aids, they have shut down, they have become so hardened within themselves and narrow within their own thought process that, hey, nothing I say gets through to them. And so what I'm tempting to do is to make another approach to truth that they might see and know. So I'm telling them parables, stories, illustrating it for them in an attempt to communicate to them. And then he goes on and tells more parables. Now Matthew picks up on that, and in verse 34, 35, he brings us back to that same idea. Why is Jesus talking in parables? As if this really matters. This is really significant, the motivation behind this. And he gives us verse 34 and 35. Again, capturing that idea. And it says, all of these things Jesus spoke to the multitudes in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to them, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parable as I will utter things kept secret from the foundations of the world. We've been working on the concept. Part of the concept, of course, is the purpose. He gives that. Jesus, you'll note in verse 34, it says, all these things Jesus spoke to the multitudes in parables. And then Matthew makes this statement, without a parable, he did not speak to them. So he has done a total shift. This isn't partial. This isn't once in a while. This is a total shift. Why would he do that? Then he gives a purpose clause. And the purpose is that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. And we discovered that the word fulfill is plero. It's the content. It's the container and content idea. In other words, I've got a large container. I take the content and I put it into the container and fill it up. So what Jesus is doing in speaking his parables is literally filling up this prophecy. Jesus is fulfilling the prophecy. And the significant thing about prophecy is every time it shows up, it bespeaks, it automatically yells at you about the idea of a plan, that God has a plan, so his plan is being fulfilled. So what Jesus is doing is an expression of the heart and the plan of an almighty God, which becomes the basic concept that begins to flow through this whole passage. That God has a plan for your life, and he is filling up whatever it takes, changing preaching style, telling parables, doing miracles, whatever it takes to fill up the plan in your life, he's going to get that done. So God is moving, and he's speaking, and he's filling up the plan. So the purpose. We also looked at the idea then in the next phrase, which is a part of the same concept. The prophecy says, I will open my mouth. And we talked about the idea of parentage, which is the idea of birth. In other words, where is this all coming from? Where is this whole parable thing? Why would anybody, where is it spilling out? What produced this? And of course, it's being produced by the sovereign God himself. I will open my mouth. But the key is the idea of mouth, because that's a playoff of what Jesus did and told the Pharisees in chapter 13, that it's out of the abundance of the heart that man speaks. So we know what you are inside because we listen to your words. And when we hear your words, we see your insides. And there's no way to camouflage that. Eventually, you speak your heart. So listen to yourself. Record yourself and listen to yourself. Listen to your attitude. Listen to the way you express yourself. Listen to your words. Listen to what you're saying. Listen to the way you respond. Jesus says, I'm responding in parables. Why? Because I'm responding out of the heart of God. So all of this stuff is filling up God's plan in your life because it's coming right out of his heart. Then last week we started on this idea of power. The next phrase, I will utter things. Now we discovered that both of those statements are the same. I will open my mouth, I will utter things. Obviously, if you open your mouth, you utter things. So, hey, he just said the same thing. Not quite, because we discovered things has a force behind it. It's the Greek word erogamai, which is the idea of belching or vomiting. It's the idea of impulsiveness. It's the idea of I can't help myself. It's the idea of this is the only time, by the way, where where this word is used. And it's the idea that I've eaten this big meal and it's just created such an eruption in my stomach that it just escapes out of my lips in a belch. God is belching out his truth for your life like he can't help it. It's an interesting picture, isn't it? That he would give that kind of a picture of his expression, of his plan and his desire for your life. That he just cannot help himself. That was the song, friends, that we just sung. I want to break that down for you with three handles. One is the origin. Obviously, where all of this is coming from is God. The sovereign God is the one out of which this is coming. And you can say, well, it's coming out of the man called Jesus, and that is absolutely true, but this man called Jesus is filled with the Spirit of God, and it's literally expressing the heart of God. And so Jesus, who is filled with the Spirit of God, giving the mind of God, is literally belching out these parables, this truth, in an attempt to get through to people who say, I'm not interested. I don't care. I'm not going to listen. And yet, Jesus continues after them out of the sovereign heart of God. So the sovereign God is speaking the parables through the person of Jesus. Now, if you get a hold of that, that sets the boundaries for this whole parable thing. In other words, the boundaries of the discussion of the parables are all found in the desire and the heart of God for your life. This is not a matter of opinion. Well, that's what you think. This is what I think. That's not what we're dealing with. This is not, well, your church says, my church says, your denomination says, mine. That's not what we're dealing with. Oh, well, my preacher says, your preacher, that's not what we're dealing with. Well, I was raised, that's not what well, my religion, that's not what we're dealing with. What we're dealing with is the sovereign person of God who is revealing who he is. And that's not up for discussion. That's not up for debate. That's not up for grabs. That's not up for, well, let's study it and come up with an idea. God is expressing his own individual inner heart to you. That encourages me. Well, I don't like that preacher. I don't care. It's okay. You don't have to like me. It's right. It's quite all right. Although I'm such a likable guy, I don't know why you wouldn't. But if you don't, it's still okay because this is not my deal. Do you get that? This is his deal. This is his deal. So whatever the church has done to you, well, that preacher made me mad. Well, that somebody down there, see, whoever ticked you off, whatever happened, That's totally immaterial because the church has made all of us mad. I mean, come on. The problem with the church is it was perfect until you came. Then it got all messed up. So, hey, I don't know what to tell you. But this is not about the church. Do you get that? This is not about the church. This is about a sovereign God who is the source of truth that says, I got to get through to you. I absolutely got to get through to you. And if I have to change my preaching style, if whatever I have to do, whatever has to be done, I'm going to speak to you. So God is speaking. But if you continue with this, God is speaking. God is desperately speaking, not just speaking. He's desperately. That's the impact of the concept, because he's belching. See, this is not, well, I'll whisper to you in the night hour. No, I'm going to belch all over you. I'm going to vomit this stuff all over you. That's a pretty good image, isn't it? Woo! That's an interesting imagery. Wayne helped me last Saturday because he came up and said, probably a good illustration of this would be the volcano. It's got all of this fire and burn in its belly, and it just... That's the picture here. That's the exact picture here, man. That there's a sovereign God who is desperately, desperately speaking to you. Now, the twist in this is how strong you think his words are to you is determined by how much you believe in him and who he is. The strength of his words to you, whether you value them, whether they're worth something to me, whether you hang on every one of them, whether you, I desire, what is God saying? That depends on how you view him. And the Pharisees just, and wouldn't it be awful if God loves you? Well, yeah. Wish you'd never heard it before. Wish I could be the one to tell you for the first time. Woo! That there is a sovereign God who is belching his love all over you. And in this case, he's doing it in parables, which in the context says the Pharisees who have turned him off, they've had every kind of message given to them in every kind of way, from theology to argument to logic, and they've shut it all down. They will not listen. So Jesus now says, hey, I'm gonna belch all over you in parables, which means he's not. Listen, if he won't give up on the Pharisees, he's not going to give up on you. Because the Pharisees are the most irritating people in the world. I know because I've been one. Pharisees are awful because they know it all. They're self-righteous. They look down their nose at everybody. And you can't tell them everything because they know everything. Remind you of anybody? And Jesus says, I'm not giving up on them. If he doesn't give up on them, he's not going to give up on you. Wow. Now, that's the origin idea. So all of this whole thing is spilling out of this sovereign God who is speaking out of his inner being. Which brings us to the idea of obsession, which again is just adding obsession in the passage. I will utter things kept secret. And I can hardly wait to get to that kept secret stuff, because I love to tell secrets. So tell me a secret and I'll tell it from the pulpit. Woo! And he's going to begin to tell some secrets. Isn't that phenomenal? So I can hardly wait to talk about that. But back to this obsession thing. This obsession produces the speaking. In other words, why is God speaking in parables? Why is the sovereign God speaking in parables? Because he has this obsession. And the obsession drives the speaking. Now you realize it's not the other way around. In other words, the inner nature of God and what he is in his innermost nature is the drive, is the boiling volcano, is the fire it's the lava that's glowing red. It's what he is inside, in his nature, in his makeup. See, what you believe about the nature of God really matters, because it's boiling inside of him, and it just has to, it is his obsession, and it just has to spill out. So what he says in the parables comes from this boiling obsession that's within. Now, the obsession does not determine what's within. What's in determines the obsession. That's not the way it is with us. I went to one of these, they call them rendezvous. Ever been to one? Never heard of it, right? See, in the olden days, they had these trappers. The old mountain man would go back in the mountains and by himself and do all this trapping. And then when the spring came, the winter broke and the spring came, they would all gather together in a rendezvous. And they'd have muzzleloaders and they'd have contests and they'd have a feast and they'd sell their wares and buy new traps and, it was a big deal. And then when the mountain man went away, all that went away except a bunch of guys got an obsession and began to be mountain men. Oh, only on the weekend. It became an obsession. And it was phenomenal. You go to this rendezvous and here's all these guys dressed in these mountain men wear, and some are dressed as Indians, and I could pull that off, but some are dressed as Indians, and they had contests, and they got muzzle loaders, and they got all the stuff, and they have all, and they live for these rendezvous. It's a whole world, and it's their obsession. But their nature doesn't determine that obsession. See, they're mean at their job. They're mean at the rendezvous. Whatever their nature is, it's going to be there, but it doesn't produce the obsession. That's not the way it is with God. Guess what his obsession is? You. Love. And you understand love is never just love. Love always has an object. Well, I'm in love. What's her name? It's never I'm just in love. I'm in love with somebody. See, love always has to have an object. And down inside of God is this nature. Oh, if I could convince you of this. Down inside of God is this nature that's just boiling, just burning, just on fire, man. It consumes him. It's just everywhere. It's everywhere in the scriptures, and it's just constantly displaying itself in every activity, every thought process of God. He doesn't do anything at all. Do you realize that God never moved his little finger one single time in the Old Testament that it wasn't for you? And here's the Pharisees, man. They've been looking for him. They've been talking about him all their lives. Their dads talked about him. Their grandfathers talked about him. Their forefathers all talked about this Christ that was to come. He shows up, and what do? Blow him off. And Jesus says, I'm not giving up on you, man. Because the love that's boiling in my being is forcing me to speak in parables. I got to get through to you. Whatever it takes. Could I tell you? He's doing that for you. And I just want to warn you, sleep in the services. Go ahead, sleep in the services. It only makes it worse. because then he doubles his effort. Why don't you give yourself to him? Jesus. Love always has an object. Love is always focused on that object. And love always sacrifices for that object. We have become the object of your heart. You are focused exclusively on us. And you have sacrificed and are constantly sacrificing. Forgive us, O sovereign God, tonight. That we have abused it. We've gotten mad at you because you didn't do what we wanted to do when you were a God of love and knew what was best for us, and we wouldn't trust you. Forgive us, O God. Forgive us, O God. And God, could I kneel at an altar tonight, and could I weep? And could I cry out and say, oh God, I am so sorry. I've not listened, and you couldn't give me straight out truth. You had to tell it in story form. You couldn't speak to my heart like you wanted to because I just turned my hearing aid off. I shut you down. And yet you wouldn't give up. You kept coming after me. How long have you been speaking to some of us? How far have you gone? And you do it in delight. You are belching your love all over us tonight. Heads are bowed. Wouldn't it be something if you'd get out of your seat and kneel, face his love tonight? Wouldn't it be something if all the barriers that you have erected you set aside tonight? In the name of Jesus. Moments of seeking. Moments of seeking.